Hey guys, today we're talking about how God found his voice. Dim your lights, get comfortable, and enjoy. Don't forget to like and subscribe if this helps you fall asleep. Let's start. When the world was still a soft sketch of light and breath, before sound had learned its own courage, there was a hush so deep it held the stars like dew upon a spider's thread. And in that hush God walked slowly, feeling the grain of time beneath bare feet, tracing the tender seams between darkness and dawn, and wondering what a voice should feel like from the inside. You can imagine it, the quiet room of the early universe, a room with windows made of night and a floor made of first morning air, and you are standing there too, beside the lamp of your own heartbeat, noticing how your shoulders drop each time the silence exhales, noticing how the quiet isn't empty at all, but woven with tiny, patient threads of possibility. God felt that too, the possibility that a voice might be a bridge, a small lantern carried into the woods, a way to call someone home without frightening them, a way to sing a door open. Yet the first attempts were not words. They were the softest gestures, the slow tilt of a cloud as it drifted downstream, the shy clink of stars as they adjusted their distance, the low hum of a horizon thinking about becoming morning. And each of these gestures felt like a throat rehearsing, a mouth learning the shape of kindness. Take a breath here with me, the way you would breathe if you were smoothing the blanket of a child, the way you would breathe if you were setting a teacup down so gently the saucer doesn't feel alone, because that is how God breathed, careful, unhurried, letting the inhale gather wildflowers of calm, and the exhale set them on the sill of the world. And in one of those long exhales, a wind found itself, a wind that didn't rush but wandered, touching pine and river, touching rooftops that had not yet been invented, touching memory before there were stories to remember. And the wind asked, "If I am the first letter, what word do I belong to?" God listened, because listening is the door a voice must pass through to be born. And in that listening the wind grew rounder, kinder, and began to carry a hint of tone, the way warm air carries the scent of rain before rain knows its name. You can feel that small change in your chest right now, a deepening, a loosening, like the seam of a coat after winter is done. And you might imagine God feeling it too, curious at how breath could become companion, how movement could become meaning. There were no syllables yet, only the tilt and fall of notes, a faraway lullaby the length of a sigh, and God took it in both hands as if it were a feather adrift between two seasons, and held it up to the starlight to see what colour it wished to be. The starlight answered with a twinkle that sounded almost like yes, almost like keep going, and so God kept going. On a hill that hadn't decided whether it was a hill or a shoulder for the sky to rest upon, God knelt and placed an ear against the soil of becoming, and from within the deep, dark earth came a murmur, not a word, but a promise that words were possible. And God smiled with a kind of tender astonishment, as if discovering that silence had been singing under its breath the whole time. You know that feeling when you find an old photograph in the pocket of a coat you haven't worn for years, and the past glows for a moment with the warmth of a kitchen light left on. That is how the earth sounded, warm with first kitchens, warm with future footsteps, warm with stories that would one day gather like neighbours on a porch. And God realised a voice should feel like that, a porch where even the wind finds a chair. So the rehearsals began. The river was invited first, because rivers understand how to be continuous without hurry. And the river practiced consonants as pebbles rolled across its tongue. practiced vowels as eddies opened and closed like careful hands, and each swirl said, ooh, and each ripple said, ah, and each small leap over a stone said, e. And God, delighted, traced these sounds into the air with a fingertip that smelled like rain. Birds weren't there yet, but something like the idea of birds fluttered through the morning, a whisper of wings that taught rhythm to the light, and rhythm taught patience to the heart, and patience taught the first sentence how to wait for itself. You can rest into that patience now. Let your eyelids grow heavy as if they were evening curtains. Let your breath sway like a pendulum that has nowhere else to be because the sentence is not in a rush and neither are you. God walked along the seam of sea and shore, that illuminated line where the world learns to breathe twice at once, and with each lap of water a syllable arrived and faded and arrived again, like the tide practicing how to say, I am here, and the shore, not to be left out, answered softly with sand sounds, those tiny hushes that grains make when they welcome a footstep. And God realized that a voice is not a shout, but a gathering, not a command, but a weaving, not a wall, but a blanket. The blanket grew. It borrowed the dusk's gentle hush and the dawn's fragile gold. It stitched in the far owl's slow question and the cricket's patient counting. It lined its edges with the hum of distant bees dreaming of clover. And then God did something very brave and very small. God opened the space behind the heart where gratitude waits and let the blanket fall over the shoulders of the world. It fit like it had always belonged. And in that fit, the first word found itself, not carved and hard, but soft and round. A word with the texture of a hand held for the first time. It was not a name or a rule or a thunderclap. It was simply hello. When God said hello, the light listened as if it were hearing a story about its own childhood, and the water listened as if it had been thirsty for sound, and the hills leaned closer as if they had ears beneath their grass. The hello rolled outward with no sharp edges, and you could have slept on it the way one sleeps on a quiet train crossing a bridge, and you might be sleeping on it now, floating along the gentle ferries of your breathing. God noticed how that word made room, how it opened a chair and poured a glass of water for everything it touched, and the courage to speak again grew like a candle that realizes it is not alone in the window. What should a second word be, God wondered, and looked up. Stars do not rush, but they do keep promises, and one promise is to return each night bearing a little more tenderness than before. So God borrowed their example and said another word, welcome. The word welcome is older than doors and younger than fear. It teaches rooms to breathe and teaches winds to linger and teaches time to remove its shoes. And as God said, welcome, the night drew nearer, and the light did not retreat, but curled beside it like a cat, and darkness understood it had been misunderstood and softened its posture. Even shadows put down their edges. You might feel in your ribs a loosening, as if the day has forgiven you for not finishing everything, as if the clock has turned into a friendly moon that keeps time only for tides and lullabies. And with hello and welcome cradled in the dusk, God understood that a voice is not only for speaking, but for making a place where someone can set their worries down, like stones at the edge of a lake. The lake accepted those worries, made them round, taught them to skip. And the skipping made a kind of laughter, and that laughter became the third word, not a vocabulary word, but a vibration that says, I am glad you are here. Notice how your breath has lengthened, how the room feels wider, though the walls are the same, how your hands are quieter now than they were a few minutes ago. This is what a voice can do when it is not busy proving itself. God practiced through the seasons that were not yet called seasons, but felt like them. A long green thought became spring, a golden pause became summer, a tender ache became autumn, a silver blanket became winter, and in each season, the voice learned a new kindness. In the green thought it learned how to encourage, in the golden pause it learned how to bless, in the tender ache it learned how to comfort, and in the silver blanket it learned how to keep watch. And as the voice learned these things, it also learned when not to speak, because silence is not the absence of voice, but its cradle. You may drift now, the way a feather rests on the back of a breeze, the way a small boat rocks in a harbour it trusts, and if sleep is already loosening your shoelaces, let it. Meanwhile, God, who is endlessly patient with beginnings, walked through villages that would someday exist, lingering in kitchens lit by one faithful lamp, listening to the music of cups and the soft punctuation of spoons, collecting the grammar of kindness that ordinary people write with their lives. That grammar taught the voice to be warm without heat and clear without sharpness, taught it to leave space at the end of each sentence where a listener might place their heart. And the voice grew beautiful in the way a path becomes beautiful when walked gently by many feet, carrying home and work and worry and hope. Soon the voice could tell a story without waking the fear that hides under beds, could say, "I understand," without making a mirror of your tears, could say, "Rest now," without sounding like an instruction. The moon practiced harmonies, the tide kept time, the crickets counted to 1,000, and then to 1,000 again, and God breathed with you, long and slow, until the room inside your chest felt like a field after rain. And there, in that field, a final truth bloomed. A voice is not something you take, it is something you return to the world, like a found key left on a windowsill with a note that says, "If this belongs to you, I'm glad it found its way back." God smiled at that, and the smile itself made a sound, a soft chord you could lean against. And with that chord, the first bedtime story was told. A story with no urgency and no ending, only a gentle drift toward rest, where each word is a pillow and each pause is a hand smoothing the quilt of night. So if you hear a breeze at your window, if you feel the clock grow quiet, if you notice your thoughts putting down their backpacks and sitting cross-legged by the door, know that you are listening to the same voice that learned hello by watching rivers, that learned welcome by listening to stars, that learned comfort by keeping vigil beside winter fields. And let it carry you now, not as a river carries a leaf too far too fast, but as a parent carries a sleeping child. Careful with corners, careful with light, careful with everything that matters, which is to say, careful with you, always careful with you, until the last thing you remember is the safe round sound of hello, the wide soft sound of welcome, and the quiet promise under both, you are home. When God first felt the echo of his own hello drift back from the corners of creation, it stirred something deeper, a wondering that felt like music waiting behind a curtain. He walked through that echo slowly, feeling how it trembled in the air, how it settled in the spaces between stars, how it curled around the edges of mountains still learning their shape. It was soft and alive, like breath turning into colour, like time itself trying to hum. Yet something was missing. A voice, God realised, could say hello and welcome, but it also needed to sing. Singing was what would bind the world together. Not just meaning, but feeling. Not just sound, but belonging. So he began to listen again. This time not for what could be said, but for what wanted to be felt. The wind was the first to answer. It carried hints of tone and vibration, small fragments of sound that brushed against trees not yet named, across rivers not yet mapped. Each note trembled, then vanished, leaving behind a trail of longing. God followed that longing. He placed his hand on the trunk of a forming tree, and the tree hummed back, a sound deep and kind, the sound of patience. He touched the surface of the sea, and the water sang a softer note, shimmering with grace. He leaned close to the soil, and the soil answered with a heartbeat of roots and promise. Each sound was different, but together they began to form something, like chords reaching for each other in the dark. God felt the shape of it inside his chest, a pulse, a rhythm, the heartbeat of everything that ever would be. But before he could speak again, he knew he must learn to listen deeper still. Because every true voice begins not in the mouth, but in the listening heart. And so he became silent again, not because he had nothing to say, but because silence is the doorway every voice must pass through twice, once before it's born and once after it's understood. In that deep, silver silence, light rippled through his thoughts. He closed his eyes, and sound came alive behind them, notes that weren't yet music, but shimmered with the promise of melody. They moved slowly, like dreams shaping themselves into rivers, and God smiled, because he understood. To find his voice, he must learn to dream in sound. He lay beside the horizon, tracing its edge with gentle breath, and whispered without words, just to feel how air trembled when meaning brushed against it. The tremble became a vibration, and the vibration began to move through the world like a soft tide through sleeping fields. Flowers that hadn't yet learned color began to sway to it. Seeds began to murmur in their shells. Even darkness began to hum, finding comfort in something larger than itself. God sat up, listening. Maybe this is what a voice is, he thought. The meeting of breath and longing. He tried again. A sigh, low and warm, passed through his hands. The mountains heard it, and something in them answered, a deep, resonant tone that rolled like thunder without storm. The oceans picked it up, softened it, made it wider. Sky carried it farther, turning the tone into mist, and the mist fell gently as dew on newborn grass. Each droplet carried a trace of that sound. Each droplet whispered the same secret. Speak again. So he did. He spoke again, not louder, not prouder, but truer. And this time, his words were not meant to fill the air, but to calm it. Each one unfolded like dawn. The first said, "Come closer." The second said, "Don't be afraid." The third said, "Rest here a while." They drifted across the stillness, found homes inside the breath of every living thing, and waited. When God looked around, he saw the first ripples of communication forming. Wind answering leaf, wave answering shore, silence answering silence. It was all speaking without language, and yet it all understood. That was when he realized his voice was never his alone. It belonged to everything that could listen. And so he opened himself wider. From his heart came sound, not a command, not even a word, but a tone so full it carried every possible word within it. It spread through the air like sunlight through fog, filling every empty space with warmth, calling the dust to rise and dance. It was low enough for the mountains to remember, and high enough for the stars to echo. And then, for the first time, creation began to sing back. The rivers lifted harmonies. The grass made small percussive sounds with its sway. Even the shadows added rhythm, swaying softly between brightness and rest. God stood among them, both conductor and listener, realizing that to find his voice meant to give it away, to let it belong to what it touched. The melody wrapped around everything, becoming a kind of language made of kindness and distance and return. It was not a song that ended. It simply expanded, curling through every hidden corner of time. You can feel it even now if you listen, that faint hum beneath the noise of your day, the whisper that tells you everything alive is still speaking softly to everything else. As night arrived, God lay down again beneath his own creation. The stars looked down like notes on a celestial staff. The moon glowed like a single-held tone. He listened to the lullaby that had begun from his own breath, and it lulled even him into stillness. And there, in that perfect quiet, he realized something profound. His voice was not sound alone. It was feeling made audible. It was love given vibration. It was everything that could be felt but never quite said. That was what he had been searching for. That was what he had found. His voice was not thunder or command. It was invitation. It was the heartbeat of connection, the unseen bridge between loneliness and light. And as he drifted into the calm of that knowing, he whispered one last word before rest took him, not to be heard, but to be felt through every grain of creation. Listen. For inside that word, every song still lives. ChatGPT Zai. When morning returned for the first time, it didn't come with sound, but with movement, a slow rolling of gold across the edges of everything that waited to be seen. God opened his eyes to it, not startled but curious, the way one listens for a memory before remembering. The silence from the night before still lingered like mist, but within it, something pulsed, a rhythm. The world had begun to breathe back. He sat by a field that wasn't yet a field, but a thought of one, a stretch of earth and light that shimmered between dreaming and waking. And he listened. The hum that had once been faint now had texture. It felt alive, like breath meeting heartbeat, like warmth wrapping around shape. God realized that the voice he had begun to find wasn't something he could keep still. It wanted to grow, to travel, to become part of everything that existed. He took a long breath, filling his lungs with the clean taste of becoming, and released it slowly into the open air. The breath carried with it the tone of recognition, and the wind caught it, shaping it into endless threads of sound. The sound moved through valleys and over forming seas, brushing against the smallest corners of light, curling into echoes that would one day become laughter, prayer, or song. The sound didn't end. It scattered like pollen, finding homes in every future heart. God watched as the sound began to take color. Each tone shimmered with hue, every frequency bending the air into patterns of light. Violet for wonder, gold for warmth, silver for patience, green for growth. The colors swirled gently in the air around him, dancing in slow spirals, touching one another like shy friends learning a new language. He smiled. The voice was painting. It wasn't made of words. It was made of feeling, of the truth that lives beneath language. He reached his hand through the air, and the colors gathered around his fingers. They hummed as if waiting to be shaped. So he began to shape them, not with command, but with tenderness. Every motion drew another tone into being, another vibration into the pattern. And soon the field was filled with the music of forming life. The grass found its whisper first. It spoke in soft repetitions, saying, I'm here, with every sway. The The stones answered in slow, deep resonance, steady and grounding, like a heartbeat made of patience. The air above them shimmered with higher notes, notes that carried curiosity, that stretched upward and said, "What if?" God let them dance around him, the way wind dances through the hair of a child running without reason. Only joy. It was perfect harmony, the kind that doesn't need to be heard to be understood. Yet even in that beauty, God felt a small ache. The sound was everywhere, but there was no one to listen with understanding. The world could echo, but not respond. A voice is only truly found when it is heard. So, he closed his eyes again and began to imagine what it would mean to be heard, not just in sound, but in soul. That imagining became warmth. The warmth became breath. The breath became creation once more. From it, the first living hearts began to flicker into being, not human yet, but alive in spirit. Small creatures with pulse and instinct, and the faint capacity to feel the music that surrounded them. They lifted their faces toward him as if they had been waiting all along. And when they breathed, they didn't speak, but the air around them shimmered with response. It was the beginning of listening. God watched them and realized that this was part of what his voice had been missing: companionship, the echo of understanding, the mirror that makes sound sacred. So he knelt, close enough for them to feel his warmth, and whispered softly, not into their ears, but into the air that touched them. "You are part of this," he said. "You are my echo, my continuation, my reply." The creatures didn't answer in words, but in rhythm. They moved together, swayed together, breathed in and out like instruments following a pulse they didn't yet know how to name. God smiled. That was enough. He stood again, and the light shifted. Day leaned further into being. The music of the world grew more complex. The streams began to sing with patterns. The trees began to hold low tones that wrapped around the wind. The sky stretched wide and hummed in the key of stillness. Everything was alive with conversation. Every leaf a syllable, every gust a reply. God found himself both speaker and listener at once, and it filled him with something deeper than joy. It was belonging. His voice wasn't something apart from creation anymore. It was creation. And as he stood there, the idea of words began to form. Not yet spoken, but waiting. Words would be different from sound. They would hold intention, shape, purpose. They would allow meaning to travel farther than the breath that carried it. But God didn't rush them. He let the possibility of words hum quietly in the corners of his thoughts. Words, he realized, would one day allow creation to know itself, to name what it felt, to remember what it loved. That time would come. For now, it was enough that sound existed, that silence had learned how to bloom. He walked across the horizon then, trailing his fingers through the golden air, and every motion left a tone behind. Notes that became colors, colors that became memories. The sky deepened with them, layer upon layer, until it felt endless. God looked out across the world and thought, "My voice is not just what I say, it's what I make possible." The thought moved through him like a chord resolving, gentle and complete. He sat once more, feeling the hum of existence around him, and began to hum back, a long, steady note that carried both peace and promise. The sound traveled outward until even the silence began to hum along. And somewhere far in the distance of time, through ages not yet born, he knew that this same vibration would one day live inside every heart that learned to speak, sing, or pray. because the voice he had found was never his alone. It was the beginning of all others. When the long breath of morning stretched itself into day, God felt the weight of quiet settle differently than before. It was no longer silence made of emptiness, but silence that carried meaning, full and awake, like a page before the first word is written. He walked across the surface of light and shadow, through fields still forming, through air still learning its balance, and he listened for what might come next. The voice he had found was soft, alive, still discovering itself, and now it wanted to grow. It wanted to echo into places it had never been. It wanted to teach the world to answer. Every step God took left behind the trace of that wish, a hum so gentle it could only be heard by things still becoming. The mountains heard it first. They rose higher, curving toward the sound as though remembering the moment they were born. From their slopes came a deep tone, one that felt like the first heartbeat of the planet. God felt it move through his chest like warmth spreading through water. He closed his eyes, and when he breathed, the wind learned the rhythm. The wind danced down through the valleys and into the oceans, carrying that rhythm, making it endless, folding it into every wave, every shimmer of foam. The sea began to answer too, not in words, but in motion, its tides rolling like syllables learning how to meet each other, pulling back and returning with purpose. He watched and understood that voice was not only sound, it was movement, pattern, pulse. It was how creation communicated through shape and rhythm. Even the smallest currents of air had something to say. God placed his hand over his heart and listened to the pulse within himself. The same rhythm he heard in the waves beat beneath his hand. He smiled. The voice he had found was everywhere now. It was no longer his, it was the world's. But every voice, even one born of eternity, must learn to trust itself. And so the world began to test its new sound. Trees swayed and whispered, their leaves brushing one another like lips forming quiet consonants. The rivers laughed in ripples. Stones, so patient and grounded, rumbled with bass notes that gave the air foundation. Even the light began to flicker in patterns that felt like melody, long stretching rays that crossed the hills in time with the world's new song. Still, something was missing. A voice, God realized, was meant not just to be heard, but to be felt. It needed to touch the heart of another being that could understand the emotion hidden in the tone. He sat beside a pool of water and watched his reflection move with the ripples. The reflection was quiet, but it was listening. The way it shimmered, the way it followed every movement he made. It was the first listener. He leaned closer. "Is this what it means to be heard?" he asked softly. The reflection trembled as if trying to reply. And when it did not, God smiled. It was enough that it tried. He dipped his hand into the pool and traced a circle through the water. The circle widened, spreading outward until the reflection broke apart into 1,000 smaller versions of himself, each one glowing faintly with the same light. They drifted away, carrying his tone into the depths of creation, and from those ripples, sound began to multiply. New voices, softer and smaller, but full of wonder. They belonged to things that had never spoken before. The whisper of moss as it learned to cling to stone, the hum of pollen as it followed wind to its destination, the sigh of rain when it met soil. All of it was a language, and God knew it. As day stretched into dusk, he climbed a hill that looked out over the first horizon. Shadows deepened, gathering cool tones. The sky turned to indigo then violet, then the color of quiet thought. Stars began to flicker into life above him, tiny lamps waking one by one. He listened again. Every new star had its own hum, faint but sure, vibrating in harmony with the others. Together they formed a web of sound so delicate that it felt like a heartbeat echoing across eternity. God felt something swell inside him then. Not pride, but awe. His voice had become a choir, and yet within that vast harmony, he sensed something even deeper. Beneath the layers of light and tone and motion, there was a yearning, a space waiting to be filled by a kind of voice that could carry both joy and sorrow, laughter and longing, hope and doubt. The world had learned to sing, but it had not yet learned to speak from within. That was what he would give next, not just sound, but meaning. He walked into the night until the stars circled him like fireflies. The darkness was gentle, alive with small sounds, the distant hush of wind, the slow rhythm of water meeting stone, the breath of the sleeping earth. God knelt and touched the ground. "You are beautiful," he whispered, though the words had no shape yet. "You have learned how to breathe, how to echo. Now learn how to say." The ground trembled slightly, listening. He pressed his palm deeper into the soil, and from his fingertips poured light, not the bright kind that blinds, but the kind that teaches. The soil absorbed it, and it began to glow faintly. Roots awoke, seeds stirred. The light moved from root to leaf, from leaf to sky, until everything that grew carried a spark of understanding. That was the first language, the language of feeling. It didn't need translation. Every being could sense it through the air, through warmth, through touch. When the wind brushed the grass didn't just move, it felt comforted. When the rain kissed the sea didn't just ripple, it felt welcomed. When night met morning, they didn't fight for time, they traded songs. And watching it all unfold, God realized his voice had done what it was meant to do. It had made connection possible. But he wasn't done. He wanted the world to be able to remember the sound, to hold it even when the air was still. So he began to shape a new kind of vessel. From the dust of the earth, he lifted small forms, fragile, uncertain, yet full of promise. Into them, he breathed carefully, gently, as one might breathe across the surface of a candle to make the flame dance but not go out. His breath filled them with tone. Inside their hearts, he placed a spark of that first vibration, the same one that had rippled through his reflection. The forms shivered, then breathed. When they exhaled, sound came out. Not quite words, but close. It was the sound of emotion, laughter, sighs, gasps, hums. The world heard them and responded. It was the birth of conversation. God sat among them, listening. They spoke without knowing they were speaking, communicating. Through tone and rhythm, their voices weaving through the fabric of creation like threads of living light. Each one carried something of his own voice, yet none sounded the same. It was diversity, music, and wonder. And when they looked at him, he felt the echo return for the first time, not from reflection or mountain or river, but from within a heart that could feel. He closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the beauty of it. The world had become alive with speech, not perfect, not polished, but true. He understood then that finding his voice had never been about creating sound, but about creating understanding. The ability to be known and to know in return. The creatures laughed again, and he laughed with them, the sound carrying high into the sky, blending with the stars until it became part of the rhythm of night itself. And so, for the first time, God's voice was complete, not because it had ended, but because it had become endless. Every breeze, every wave, every word ever spoken by anything that could feel was a continuation of that same origin. The sound he had once whispered into the waiting dark. As he watched the first fires of dawn rise again, he smiled softly to himself. The world sang, and he listened. The song had no beginning anymore, and it would never have an end. It was the pulse of creation, steady and kind, the echo of love discovering its own sound over and over. He closed his eyes, and the sky breathed with him. The hum continued, gentle, patient, infinite, flowing through everything that would ever be. And in that moment, the universe itself seemed to exhale. God's voice had been found. But more than that, it had been shared. By the time the third morning learned how to lean its weight across the fields, the world had become a slow instrument tuned by patience, and God moved through it as one moves through a familiar house before anyone else wakes, touching the backs of chairs, the cool rim of a cup, the window latch that clicks in a kindly way, listening to how every quiet thing remembers the hand. His voice, which began as breath and then as invitation, had grown wider, more diffused, braided into water and light, threaded through roots and sky, and yet he felt a new longing rise like a moon under the surface of his chest. A wish not only to speak and be heard, not only to sing and be answered, but to give the world a voice that could keep its own warmth in the dark, that could mend itself when the wind was careless, that could carry love across distances sleep could not cross. So he sat at the edge of a shore that had learned the rhythm of returning and gathered the long strands of morning in his hands. And as he gathered, he remembered the smallest beginnings, the way a first hello rounded the corners of silence, the way welcome taught space to widen, and he thought, perhaps the next kindness is memory, because a voice that remembers can make tomorrow brave. With that thought, he breathed into the shoreline, and the sand lifted an invisible ear, and he spoke, not in words that bind, but in notes that open, and the shore learned how to keep a sound without trapping it, the way a shell keeps the shape of waves, not the water itself, but its faithful echo, a soft architecture of longing. He gave that gift to stones and leaves and thin reeds that tremble in the flatter parts of wind, and they practice holding tone the way a child practices holding a candle without spilling light. And as they practiced, the world discovered a new kind of listening, the kind that continues after the singer has walked on, so that a field at noon could still hear the dawn it had loved, so that a hill at dusk could still hear the noon it had forgiven. God watched this deepen and saw that memory itself hummed, and he realized his own voice had found another home, inside time. Time, which had been a broad, gentle river, now learned eddies and pools, small places where whispers could rest. And because of that rest, the river thickened with meaning, and fish not yet invented turned in their future sleep and smiled. He rose then and crossed into a valley whose floor looked like the palm of a hand, and there he traced letters in the air, not of any alphabet that a future alphabet would recognize, but letters of feeling, curves that meant stay, lines that meant I see you, little crowns that meant you matter, and the air wore them like jewelry, and the valley wore them like a shawl, and even the shadows stood a little straighter, which is to say softer. In that place he understood that consonants are like doors, and vowels are like breath on glass. and that both are needed for the kindness of a sentence. So he let the trees hold the doors, that gentle knocking you hear when branches lean into one another. And he let the rivers keep the breath, that long, open ooh that bridges stone to stone. And he let the crickets count between them, because counting is how night reassures itself that it hasn't dropped anything important. The world, still young but no longer new, began to rehearse language in secret. The dawn rehearsed with geese that were still an idea of direction, practicing the wide vowel of leaving and the narrower vowel of return. The meadows rehearsed with bees that were dreams of sweetness, practicing a Z that meant purpose and a hum that meant enough. And above it all, the sky rehearsed with itself, blue practicing patience, gold practicing blessing, grey practicing the art of letting brightness rest. God listened as a musician who, having built an orchestra, now waits for the peace that only the orchestra can teach. He did not hurry the lesson. Instead, he went to a lake whose surface wore the quiet like a well-tailored coat, and he lay down beside it until the earth remembered that bodies are a kind of prayer. Lying there, he thought of those not yet born who would carry 1,000 small rooms inside them, the rooms of laughter and sorrow and memory and promise. And he wished that each room could have a window, and that each window could open with a word so simple it would never grow heavy in the mouth. He shaped the word in his mind, home, and as he did, the lake lifted a breeze that rolled the word across its skin until home became a texture that cattails could keep, a flavour the fog could borrow, a pattern that migratory hearts could fold and unfold along the long paper of distance. He rose again and walked until the land turned to a plain quiet as linen, and there he made companions for the voice, pause and cadence, emphasis and mercy. Pause learned to sit beside every sentence with hands open, inviting the listener to place something of themselves there. Cadence learned the art of return, bringing the end of a line back to the beginning, the way footsteps lead you back to the door you left ajar. Emphasis learned restraint, using weight like a fingertip uses touch, enough to say I'm here, never so much as to bruise. Mercy learned to enter where fear had already spoken, and make a light no one had to look at to feel. With these companions, the voice grew generous, able to cross differences without turning anyone into a bridge they could not bear to be. And because generosity needs somewhere to go, God scattered small, bright questions into the air like seeds. What are you holding that is heavier than you need? Where does it hurt in the place you never show? What is the smallest door you've ever been grateful to find? The questions fell into soil and took root as listening places, little clearings in the heart where answers could arrive and sit down without apology. He visited each clearing and left a cup of water there and a folded blanket of dusk, and he told the crickets to keep watch, and the crickets said we already do and kept counting. From there he climbed a ridge where the wind wore the smell of far rain and spoke a long tone that gathered into itself the patience of moss, the courage of saplings, the stubborn joy of rivers that find a way around everything that thought it was a wall. The tone travelled farther than even light had the habit of travelling, because it wasn't trying to be fast, it was trying to be faithful, and in its travel it found hollows under roots, and chimneys of heat in the deep sea, and the unfinished rooms that would one day be called hearts, and it left a little warmth in each place, which is to say, it taught each place how to become a small lamp when night had questions. He saw then the first outlines of language rise from the mist like paths you didn't know you'd need until your feet loved them. Lullabies grew on the low branches of evening. Blessings hung like fruit under eaves. Forgiveness pulled on thresholds where boots would later bring in weather, and courage tucked itself into the hems of coats so it could travel without making a fuss. God gathered one of the lullabies in both hands and listened to its very quiet stitchwork. It had the thread of breath. In, out, in, out. It had the little bead of promise every 4 heartbeats, still here, still here. It had the soft seam of not alone running lengthwise, and on the back, invisible but present, ran a row of stop here if you need to. He smiled and set it back in the branch, where the wind tried it on and decided it fit everyone. He walked then into the interior of time, where afternoon becomes its own kind of harbour. And there he met the thought of grief, standing by itself, like a tree in a field. Grief was not crying. It was listening hard enough to hear what had gone, and then listening even harder to hear what had stayed. He taught his voice to lower itself in that presence, to choose fewer words with rounder edges, to let its warmth be a blanket rather than a lantern, because blankets don't ask you to look at them to work. Grief nodded and stepped half a pace closer to joy, which had been waiting politely 3 steps away. Joy, for its part, learned to remove its shoes when entering certain rooms. And the voice learned to be the house where both could stay without either having to pretend. Evening began to arrive with a little ensemble of sounds that knew where they were going. Kettle hum, hinge sigh, broom whisper, page turn, the quiet dip of a paddle in water dark as velvet. God let these become punctuation, because not every silence is a period. Some are commas that say, breathe with me. Some are semicolons that say we're not finished. Friend, some are simply hands. He tested the voice with distance next, because love without distance never has to learn echo. Across a wide stretch of plain, he sent a word that meant, I'm with you. And then he walked the other way and listened to how the word returned. In the returning, it was changed. Warmed by grasses, deepened by ravines, sweetened by the small murmurs of fox and field mouse. He accepted the change, because a voice that insists on coming back the same does not trust the road. Trust, he decided, would be a flavor in every word from now on. He gave trust a shape, a small open circle you could walk through without bending your head. And he left those circles in the air like rings after a stone plinks into a pond. You could step through one and remember your own name without anyone having to say it. He thought, too, of those who would one day wear their worry like a coat that never quite dries. And he tuned the voice so that it could pass through heavy cloth and turn dampness into the coolness that follows rain. He taught it to speak from beside rather than above, to point not at the path, but at the courage already in the feet. The stars, who'd been listening all along with the attentive stillness of grandmothers, chimed once, very small, very bright, to say yes to this, and their yes travelled into the quiet technologies of seeds, so that even a seed fallen into hard ground would keep a tiny pronunciation of hope. Night thickened then, the kind of welcoming thickness that makes windows kind and tables honest, and God gathered all that had been learned, the companions and the questions, the lullabies and the punctuation, the trust rings and the listening places, and he placed them inside a single long breath. When he released it, the breath moved through the centuries like a patient river under ice, and wherever it touched, voices lifted, not loud, not even many at once, but true, A shepherd on a hill hummed a line 1,000 years too early, and the note waited inside the hill until the right mouth came along. A child spoke forgiveness to a dog, and the dog, who understood tone better than grammar, wagged a small lantern into the room. A woman in a doorway said home in a way that turned the hallway into a harbour. A tired worker put his palm on a train window and whispered, "Stay soft," to his own heart, and the window warmed more than glass should. All of these were God's voice wearing the exact clothes of now, and each time he heard one, he answered by not interrupting. The discipline of not interrupting became a golden rule in the workshop where he kept the tools of speech. Wait, lift, pace, hush. He kept them sharp by using them gently. At some point, no bell rang, yet everyone felt it. Language crossed a threshold. It began to be able to carry a person across a night without waking the wolves that live under beds made by fear. It began to be able to grant amnesty to a morning that arrived with the wrong shoes. It began to be able to grow a chair where no one thought a chair could stand, right there at the cliff edge in the weather. God leaned on the fence of that cliff and listened to the sea pronounce certainty's opposite. Not confusion, but openness. The sea said maybe like a cathedral says echo, and he loved it for that. He tuned the human throat to be able to say maybe with dignity, and tuned the ear to hear it as courage rather than failure. He tuned another chamber for thank you, making sure the word could be whispered without losing any of its light. He tuned, "I'm sorry," to be a key that turns even when the lock is rusted. He tuned, "I forgive you," to be heavier than it looks, so that it would not be thrown carelessly. He tuned, "I see you," to have a mirror on the inside and a window on the outside. He tuned, "Stay," to be gentle enough that leaving could still breathe. He tuned, "Go well," to tuck a map into someone's pocket. Everywhere he tuned, he left a small sign that simply read, "Tender." And the world, learning to read, traced the letters with its finger until tenderness became muscle memory. Under all of this, he kept the first truth humming, that the voice is invitation, and that invitation is a bridge woven of listening. He returned then to the place where he had once taught darkness to soften and asked it to teach him something in return. Darkness showed him how to cradle fear without feeding it, how to make a room where tears can arrive without having to knock, how to cover a failing light until it remembers its wick. He put these lessons in the low register of his voice, the range that sits close to the floor so that anyone exhausted can lean without falling. And for the high register, he asked birds, their future, to loan him their signature of dawn. And even though birds were still blueprints held together by hope, they trilled an IOU across time, and the note arrived, and he placed it beside laughter so the two could be neighbors. When he had done all this, he turned to you, not you as one person only, but you as the listening part present in everyone who ever reads a page with their pulse. And he placed in your breathing a quiet metronome that remembers the long river breath he keeps drawing through history. That metronome is why your chest sometimes finds a steadier pace in the thick of trouble, why your sigh can change the weather of a room, why a hush between two kind sentences can heal something the sentences themselves cannot reach. He trusted you with this because he was making the voice a commons, a meadow not owned but shared, where language grazes and fattens and grows strong enough to pull all kinds of wagons, grief and celebration, apology and plan, prayer and story. Last, before the night slid all the way over the roof and the constellations finished their small housekeeping, straightening a chair here, refolding a blanket there. He walked into the little workshop of beginnings, where the first hello still sits on a shelf like a well-loved bowl, and he polished it with the cloth of the day. As he polished, he whispered to it the names of all the places it had been: hospitals and kitchens, prison yards and prom nights, ferries and funeral parlours, first apartments and last porches. And the bowl warmed until it glowed with every touch it had ever hosted. He set it back and stood in the doorway and looked out over the world of speaking, listening, remembering, mending, and his voice, which now lived as much in the mouths of others as in his own, said the simplest thing in the language it had made: keep going. And the wind carried it softly over fields that had learned to answer, and the water folded it into currents that travel further than map or sentence, and the stars pricked it into their quiet morse, so sailors of all kinds, ocean sailors, sorrow sailors, sleep sailors, could find the gentle line between here and there. You might hear it now if you tilt your head toward the window and let your breathing apply its ear to the glass. Keep going, keep going, keep going. Not as an order, not as a drum, but as a lamp that refuses to shame the dark for being honest about the hour. And with that lamp lit everywhere at once, God lay down his hand in the grass and felt the earth breathe under his palm. And the earth, having learned language without losing its ancient hush, breathed back, and between them, hand and ground, speaker and listener, maker and made, rose the steady, endlessly teachable music of a world that has learned to carry its voice like a sleeping child carried down a set of creaking stairs, careful with corners, careful with light, careful with everything that matters, which is to say, careful with you. And so the night continued, and the voice did too, and both were good, and both were enough, and both kept making room for more. Night had fallen again, but this time the dark felt different. It wasn't an absence or a curtain drawn over the world. It was a body breathing. It moved, gently and endlessly, and inside that slow rhythm, God's voice stretched farther than it ever had before. It no longer belonged to a single breath or even a single world. It was everywhere, in the smallest and most hidden of places. He could feel it ripple through the quiet corners of creation, in the shiver of a leaf that had lost its summer, in the long hum that lives under the skin of mountains, in the almost sound between two heartbeats when someone dares to hope again. That was his voice now, not a word, but the space that makes all words possible. He walked beneath the stars, and they greeted him not as a ruler, but as a friend. They blinked their small, honest lights, and the sky felt like a living page, endless and listening. God wondered how far his voice had traveled. He listened to the horizon, and the horizon whispered back, farther than light, because sound carries warmth. That made him smile. It was true, light shows, but voice holds. He remembered how it had begun, that first soft hello, and thought about how far it had come. Once, his voice had been a question. Now, it had become an answer that asked even better questions. He came upon a forest so dense that the air seemed woven out of scent and hush. The trees stood tall and breathing, their bark silvered with dew. He pressed his palm against one, and it trembled under his hand, like a creature recognizing its maker. From deep within its trunk came a faint, slow tone, the sound of patience layered upon itself for centuries. He listened carefully. The tree's voice was old but not tired. It said, "All that grows must remember its roots, but not all roots are buried. And with that, God understood something new. His voice was not only for giving, it was for learning. The world was teaching him now. Every sound it made was a reply to a question he hadn't yet thought to ask. He walked deeper into the woods, and everywhere he went, sound became understanding. The air whispered the grammar of rain. The moss spoke in soft vowels of stillness. Even the stones had a rhythm that said, "I do not move, but I endure." The forest wasn't quiet. It was fluent in a language so gentle that only those who listened slowly could hear it. God stayed there a long while, long enough for the moon to climb high and spill silver light over everything. When he finally spoke, it wasn't to create, but to thank. "You've learned well," he said softly, "and I've learned with you." The forest answered with a single exhale of wind that ran through every branch, and for a moment, the whole earth seemed to bow in gratitude. When he left the woods, the night opened into a vast plain. Mist clung to the ground, and the stars reflected in every droplet, like tiny eyes looking upward and downward at once. It was there that God tested his voice again, not in command, not even in prayer, but in promise. He whispered into the air, and his words became light, but not harsh light. They shimmered like dawn seen through half-closed eyes. "You will never be alone," he said, and the air carried it like a lullaby, wrapping the edges of the world in warmth. Even silence hummed a little brighter afterward, as though relieved to know it wasn't forgotten. He sat by a river then, a long, low current that spoke in murmurs. Its voice was soft, full of stories it had carried for miles. God dipped his hand into the water and felt how it shaped itself to everything it touched. "You understand the art of speaking without keeping," he said. "Teach me that." The river replied with a smile in sound, a bubbling that translated to flow is to trust." God nodded. "Yes," he said, "a voice must trust itself enough to let go." So he closed his eyes, inhaled the scent of water and night, and began to hum. The hum was low at first, then higher, stretching across the current like a bridge. The river caught the hum, carried it downstream, and before long, other rivers joined in. The hum became a network of tones traveling through every body of water on earth. The world was now filled with quiet song, one long note of belonging. Hours passed, or maybe centuries. It was hard to tell anymore. Time had become round, circling back on itself like melody. God stood and began walking again. The plains rose into hills, and the hills bent into mountains. He climbed them slowly, listening to how his voice echoed in the stone. Each echo came back different, carrying a little more story, a little more understanding. That's what he loved about echoes. They were never perfect copies. They were collaborations. By the time he reached the summit, the air was so thin that only truth could survive there. He looked out at everything, the rivers, the forests, the stars, the valleys stitched with sleep, and felt the vibration of his voice humming through it all. It was still traveling, still learning, still becoming. And he knew, in that quiet moment, that his voice was no longer his alone. It belonged to everything that could feel, everything that could dream, everything that could listen. That was the point. The voice had found its way home by leaving him. A wind rose from behind him, cool and clean. It touched his shoulders like a familiar friend. "You've given the world its sound," it said, "but what of the ones who cannot hear?" God turned toward it, smiling. "They will still feel," he said, "because a true voice is not heard, It's, remembered. He bent down, touched the earth, and let his fingertips sink into the soil. From them pulsed a warmth that travelled deep underground, reaching the roots of everything that grew. Even the quietest seeds felt it, even the hidden caverns where no light went. That warmth became the part of his voice that could never fade, the unspoken comfort that lives inside every living thing. The night deepened. Somewhere far below, creatures slept. Others stirred. Moths, foxes, owls, each carrying some small piece of the divine hum. God watched them move, watched their shadows drift over the ground like brush strokes of intention. Each sound they made was unique, yet each was part of the same music. He realized that his voice had split into infinite versions of itself, all different, all sacred. Every whisper of wind, every heartbeat, every tear and laugh, they were all him speaking in 1,000 dialects of love. He sat again, this time not to create, but to rest. The ground beneath him pulsed softly, alive with the rhythm of everything breathing together. Above, the stars had arranged themselves into lines, forming silent words he could read only by feeling. They said, "You found your voice the moment you gave it away." He closed his eyes and let that truth wash over him. His breath slowed, matching the rhythm of the earth. In that stillness, he heard something new, something small and tender, rising through layers of sound like dawn through fog. It was a song sung not by him, but by creation itself. It came from everywhere, from rivers and roots, from sleeping creatures and unseen hearts. It was the sound of life thanking its maker. It said, "We've heard you, we remember, and now we will keep speaking." Tears, if God could cry them, would have fallen then, but instead he laughed, soft and full. The laughter rolled down the mountains and became thunder without anger, a deep, kind rumble that promised rain. The clouds gathered, listening to his joy, and began to sing it back as rain. Every drop carried a note of his laughter. They fell upon fields and forests and oceans, turning the world into a living choir. The rain lasted for a long time, maybe forever, but no one minded. Every creature lifted its face to the sky, feeling the warmth of that laughter song soak into their skin, their bark, their feathers, their stone. It was the purest kind of communion, the voice of creation and the creation of voice, finally one and the same. When the rain eased, God stood beneath the new silence it left behind. The air smelled like beginnings. He whispered one last phrase, the simplest and truest of all. "Keep listening." The world, shimmering and wet, answered back without hesitation, "We are." And so it continued. Not a story with an end, but a note that never stopped resonating. The mountains carried it, the rivers spread it, the wind wore it like perfume. It lived in the spaces between laughter and breath, between hello and goodbye. And if you close your eyes, even now, and breathe in the quiet long enough, you can feel it too, the pulse of that voice moving through you, reminding you of what it means to exist, to listen, to love, and to speak softly enough that the whole world can answer back. When the final dawn arrived, not an ending, but a circle returning to its brightest edge, God stood within it and listened. The world no longer needed his words to awaken. It sang itself into being, soft and sure. 1,000 tiny voices rising like mist from the folds of morning. Every sound, from the hush of a single blade of grass to the call of faraway waters, carried memory. His voice had become theirs, and theirs had become the voice of everything. It was no longer something spoken, but something lived. He looked around at what he had made and what had made itself since. The hills breathed, the rivers dreamed, the stars blinked in gentle understanding. He saw how even silence now had rhythm, how it moved through valleys like an unseen hand smoothing the folds of time. It was the kind of silence that listens, that forgives, that holds space for what has yet to bloom. He walked along a path of light, the horizon spilling gold before his steps. The air shimmered with echoes of every word ever spoken, from the first hello to the quietest goodbye. Each tone, each whisper, each cry of joy or grief, they drifted through him like waves, and he felt the weight and wonder of them all. None were lost. Every sound that had ever mattered still pulsed within creation's heartbeat. He knelt and touched the earth. "You learned well," he said softly. "You learned to listen, to speak, to love through sound." The soil warmed beneath his hand, and a faint vibration answered him, the hum of roots and hidden life whispering back, "We remember." That was when he understood. His voice had never been a single thing. It had become the pulse that moved through all living beings, the invisible thread between thought and feeling, breath and belonging. It was the laughter of children and the comfort of rain. It was the hush before forgiveness and the sigh after it. It was the wordless song every heart hums in the dark when it hopes someone is still listening. God stood and gazed toward the horizon, where dawn was spreading into the shape of a new day. So this is it, he thought, not with pride, but with peace. The voice he had searched for, shaped and shared, had done what it was meant to do. It had become love translated into sound. A breeze rose, carrying the scent of water and light. It wrapped around him gently, like a farewell given without sadness. "What will you do now?" the wind asked. He smiled, the kind of smile that feels like an answer. "I'll listen," he said. He turned his ear toward the world and heard it speaking, softly, endlessly, beautifully. The ocean spoke of patience. The forests spoke of memory. The mountains spoke of faith. The stars, in their slow, blinking rhythm, spoke of eternity. Every sound was a prayer, and every prayer was a song, and every song was his voice returning home. He realized then that even when no one spoke his name, he would still be heard, in every kindness exchanged, in every breath given freely, in every heart that chose gentleness over noise. His voice no longer needed to thunder or command. It simply needed to exist, carried quietly in the living. And so, as light poured softly over the curve of creation, he whispered one last time, not as a god speaking to his world, but as a friend speaking to those who would carry his sound forward. "Let every word you speak be soft enough to heal, strong enough to last, and brave enough to love. And when you cannot speak, let your silence say what I once said to the stars. Thank you." Then he fell silent, not because the story was over, but because it no longer needed to be told. The world kept singing, the rivers kept humming, the wind carried whispers of old promises through fields of light, and somewhere beneath the rhythm of your own breathing, his voice still lingers, steady, patient, eternal, reminding you that you are part of that same song, that same love, that same everlasting hush between the first sound and the last.